Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast, and today I'm thrilled to introduce you to a brand new series that promises to entertain, educate, and inspire. It's called Roberto in America, a collection of funny, heartfelt, and sometimes downright silly stories about Roberto, a charming Italian with big dreams and a little English navigating life in the US. Each episode in this series will feature 5 stories packed with Roberto's hilarious adventures, linguistic mishaps, and cultural discoveries. From ordering coffee to surviving the subway, Roberto's journey is not just about learning a language. It's about embracing a new way of life, one laugh at a time. But why learn through stories? Because stories make language unforgettable. They immerse us in real-life situations, teach vocabulary in context, and connect us emotionally to the learning process. Through Roberto's ups and downs, you'll discover new words, phrases, and cultural insights that stick with you because they're part of an engaging narrative. So whether you're an English learner or just someone who loves a good laugh, this series is for you. Get ready to follow Roberto's journey, learn alongside him, and perhaps even see a bit of yourself in his adventures. Now, before we start with the first story, let me tell you about the stories we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with our first story, Big Apple Dreams. When Roberto arrives in New York City, overwhelmed and enchanted, he mixes up words at customs, leading to a funny but tense exchange with officers who almost think he's here for spy work. The second story is The Italian Chef. Roberto volunteers to cook an authentic Italian dinner for new friends, but struggles with American grocery stores buying bizarre substitutes. A hilarious dinner ensues with surprising results. Then our third story is about the metro mishap. Trying to navigate the subway, Roberto misunderstands directions and ends up on the wrong side of town. He meets locals who help him in their own unique ways. Our fourth story is Lost in Translation. Roberto's first job interview becomes a comedy of errors as he misinterprets questions and idioms. Despite it all, he leaves a positive impression. And our final story for today's episode is Roberto the Romeo. Roberto tries to flirt with an American girl, but misuses romantic expressions he learned from old movies, leading to a hilariously awkward exchange. So, we've got 5 stories in our episode today, and in our series we're going to have a total of 25 episodes of Roberto in America. You don't want to miss any of these stories. Now let me remind you, of course, if you want to unlock the entire episode along with all our back catalog, which is a huge back catalog, let me remind you, today is episode 1037. So we've got a lot of episodes in our back catalog. Anyway, you can do that by becoming a premium subscriber on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. And talking about Patreon, I've got a big surprise coming your way that I'm going to announce later this week, so stay tuned. But now, without further ado, let's start with our very first story for today, Big Apple Dreams, when Roberto arrives in New York City. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Roberto stood at the gates of New York City, eyes wide with excitement. The skyscrapers, the lights, the endless traffic, everything felt like a dream, his dream. He had always imagined the hustle and bustle of the Big Apple, but nothing could prepare him for the real thing. His heart raced and the air was different, sharper, almost like it was whispering, "Welcome to America, Roberto." His plane had just landed, and now the moment of truth, customs. "Stay calm, Roberto. Just answer the questions and everything will be fine," he muttered to himself, practicing his English in a whisper. After all, he had spent months preparing for this. He knew the important phrases. "I am Roberto. I am here for tourism. I love America." Simple, right? As Roberto stood in line at customs, he noticed people looking at him. Some with raised eyebrows. Maybe they were amazed by his Italian charm. Or maybe they were just confused by his mismatched clothes. He had tried to dress like a New Yorker, but the results were questionable. Still, he had made it this far. He was going to do this. He was going to start his American dream. When it was his turn, Roberto approached the officer, trying to appear confident. The officer looked at his passport, then at Roberto, then back at the passport. "Purpose of your visit?" the officer asked, her voice monotone. "I'm here for spying," Roberto said, beaming with excitement. Then, realizing what he had said, he quickly corrected himself. No, not spying. I meant sightseeing." He laughed nervously. "You know, spying on all the good pizza places." The officer's eyebrows shot up. "Spying on pizza places, huh?" she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Roberto nodded eagerly. "Yes, pizza, hot dogs, maybe some hamburgers. I want to see everything." Then, as if to lighten the mood, he added, "And if I get bored, maybe I'll spy on Broadway." The officer's face didn't change. "Uh-huh," she said, clearly unimpressed. Realizing his jokes weren't landing, Roberto panicked and added, "But no, I promise, just sightseeing. No spying, no trouble. I love America." The officer stared at him for a long moment. Roberto could feel his face turned red, sweat beading on his forehead. He had messed up. His American dream was over before it even started. "You're here for sightseeing, right?" the officer asked, trying to hold back a smile. Yes, sightseeing," Roberto said, nodding enthusiastically. The officer looked at his passport again, then gave him a long, hard look. "All right, Mr. Roberto. Enjoy your sightseeing and maybe leave the jokes for later, okay?" Roberto blinked. "I promise, no jokes, just pizza and Empire State Building." "Good luck," she said, handing back his passport with a smile that almost made Roberto think she understood his humor. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't entirely convinced that Roberto grasped how serious customs should be. Relieved, Roberto grabbed his bags and walked away, his heart still racing. "Well," he muttered to himself, "that was close. Note to self, no jokes at customs next time." So that was our little story about Roberto. Now let's see if we can find out some vocabulary words that we can learn from the story. We have first the customs. Well, what is the customs? This is the area at the airport where your passport and luggage are checked before you enter a country. Of course, not only the United States, any country in the world. Now, for example, we say he waited in line at customs before entering the United States. Next, we have sightseeing. Well, that means visiting interesting places as a tourist. Now, Roberto said he was here for sightseeing, but his nervousness made him mix up the words. Instead of sightseeing, he said spying, which could be a very serious word, but of course, the officer saw that Roberto was just confused, and he wasn't really a spy. Then we have blurt, to say something suddenly and without thinking. Like when we say he blurted out the wrong word, like when he said spying, causing some confusion. And what about the eyebrow raise? What is that gesture? Well, this is a gesture that shows surprise or disbelief. The officer raised an eyebrow at Roberto's comment about spying on pizza places. And we also mentioned monotone, which is a voice without much expression or emotion. And here we're talking about the officer, of course. The officer asked her questions in a monotone voice. All right, these are 5 interesting words that we can learn from the story, but we can also have some key takeaways from the story. The first thing we need to remember is always use the correct words in formal situations like customs. Even small mistakes like mixing up sightseeing and spying can cause confusion or suspicion. And remember to be serious when necessary. Customs is not a place for jokes, no matter how funny you think you are. But don't get too hard on yourself, mistakes can happen, and it's important to stay calm and correct them politely, like Roberto did. And of course, sometimes humor can help, but knowing when to use it is part of learning a language effectively. So, Roberto learned that while New York City might be a place full of excitement and surprises, it's important to approach formal situations like customs with seriousness and care. With a bit more patience and practice, Roberto's journey to mastering English and starting his American dream was still on track. So that was the first story in our series, and for our episode today we have 5 stories, so we still have 4 more stories. Don't go anywhere because next we're gonna talk about the Italian chef. Stay tuned, I'll be right back. After settling into New York City, Roberto decided it was time to make friends. And what better way to win people over than with food? Back in Italy, he was known as a pretty good cook. At least his grandmother told him so every Sunday. So when his new friends, Lucy and Mark, invited him to a potluck, a term he still didn't fully understand, Roberto offered to cook an authentic Italian dinner. His friends were thrilled, and so was Roberto. He imagined plates of pasta, rich sauces, fresh herbs, the real Italian taste, he promised. But there was just one problem: shopping for ingredients in an American grocery store. Now, armed with his shopping list and big dreams of Italian flavor, Roberto entered the grocery store and immediately felt like he had walked into a different world. Shelves were stacked high with boxes and bags, cans and jars, but everything looked different. The names were unfamiliar, and some things he just couldn't find. "All right, Roberto," he whispered to himself, "you need tomatoes, basil, mozzarella, and pasta. Simple." He found the tomatoes, but they were in cans, or in little bottles called paste, or in sauce with strange ingredients like onion powder. After a moment of confusion, he grabbed a jar labeled Italian pasta sauce. Close enough, he thought, feeling optimistic. Next, he looked for mozzarella. After 10 minutes of searching, he found something white and squishy called American cheese. Must be the American version of mozzarella, he reasoned, and added it to his basket. Then there was the pasta. Back home, he'd have a choice of fresh hand-rolled pasta. Here, he found a box that said instant spaghetti, 5 minutes. He stared at it, puzzled. "Is this spaghetti in 5 minutes?" he shrugged, thinking it might be American efficiency at work, and put it in his cart. Finally, he looked for basil, but all he found were dried, crumbled leaves in little bottles with labels like basils and oregano. "Where's the green, leafy basil?" he wondered. But seeing no fresh basil in sight, he picked up a bottle of something called Italian herbs mix and hoped it would work. With his basket full of mysterious American ingredients, Roberto returned to Lucy and Mark's apartment, ready to prepare his Italian masterpiece. He started with the Italian pasta sauce, pouring it into a pot. It was thicker and redder than expected and smelled strange, but he tried not to worry. He then tossed in some American cheese for a creamy texture, mixing it until it melted into a lumpy orange paste. "Maybe this is how they do it here," he muttered, trying to stay positive. Next, he boiled the instant spaghetti. True to its promise, it was ready in 5 minutes, but it was oddly mushy, more like a noodle soup. Determined, he added it to the sauce. Finally, he sprinkled in the Italian herbs mix, hoping it would give the dish that fresh basil aroma. The mix smelled strong, but he was sure it would taste great. As he plated the pasta, Roberto felt a sense of pride. "This might be a little different, but it's still Italian," he declared, placing the bowls in front of his friends with a flourish. Lucy and Mark took their first bites and their faces froze. "It's interesting," Mark said, trying to be polite. "Very unique," Lucy added, her eyes widening as she swallowed. Roberto took a bite himself. His eyes widened as the taste hit him. A blend of ketchup, rubbery cheese, and dried herbs. It was nothing like the flavors at home, but he smiled through it, laughing along with his friends as they joked about the Italian-American fusion cuisine. So, that was what happened at that potluck party, and that brings me to the vocabulary words we're going to talk about, and potluck is the very first word. What is potluck? Well, it's a gathering where each person brings a dish to share. He was invited to a potluck where everyone brought different food. And we also talked about ingredients. Well, that's the foods and spices used to make a dish. For example, we say he searched for ingredients like tomatoes and basil in the grocery store. Then we talked about authentic. Well, that means real, genuine, or traditional. In our example, we said Roberto promised an authentic Italian dinner, but had to improvise. And then we have herbs. And these are plant leaves used to flavor food, like basil or oregano. For example, we say he couldn't find fresh herbs, so he used a dried Italian herbs mix. And finally, we have this fusion word. Well, a fusion is a combination of different styles, often in cooking. And of course, we can use it in other things, but we use it a lot in cooking. Now, in our example, we said the dish was an accidental Italian-American fusion that surprised everyone. So that was the story. These were the words. What are the key takeaways we can get from this word? Well, first thing, grocery shopping in a new country can be confusing, especially when familiar ingredients aren't available. And learning food-related vocabulary like potluck and authentic can help in understanding menus and making dishes. And finally, even when things don't go as planned, humor and openness make experiences memorable and bring people closer. So as Roberto learned, even if things don't taste as expected, good friends and a sense of humor can turn any meal into a feast. Plus, he learned a valuable lesson. Next time, he'd ask his friends for help at the grocery store. So that was the story of the Italian chef. Next, we're gonna talk about the next story, the metro mishap. You don't want to miss that. That's coming next. I'll be right back. Roberto's latest mission? Ride the New York City subway. He had been told the subway was the fastest way to get around. Simple, he thought. I'll just get on the train and go. How hard could it be? But as Roberto entered the subway station, he quickly realized that the world below ground was even more confusing than the one above. The station was buzzing with people rushing in all directions, and signs with numbers, letters, and colors were everywhere. He squinted at a map plastered to the wall, hoping it would guide him to the right place. He was supposed to visit a friend in Brooklyn. He scanned the map, spotting a line with a big B on it. Ah, B for Brooklyn, he decided confidently, not realizing that B was just the train name and could actually take him somewhere completely different. After swiping his Metro card, backward at first, then correctly, Roberto managed to board the B train. He smiled to himself as the doors closed and the train lurched forward. Easy, he thought, leaning back with a proud grin. But as he looked around, he noticed something strange. Everyone seemed to be looking at him, or at least at his backpack, which he had somehow caught in the door. As he tried to wiggle free without drawing attention, the train made a sudden stop. The announcement crackled over the speakers. Next stop, Bronx. Roberto froze. Bronx? He was supposed to be going to Brooklyn. Panic began to rise in his chest as he realized he was heading in the completely wrong direction. He looked around, hoping someone would tell him what to do, but everyone seemed lost in their own world. Finally, he spotted a young man wearing headphones who looked friendly enough. "Excuse me," Roberto said, tapping him on the shoulder. "I need to go to Brooklyn." The man blinked, pulling out one earbud. "Dude, you're on the wrong train. This one's going uptown to the Bronx." Roberto's face fell. "Oh no. How do I get to not Bronx?" The young man chuckled. "All right, let's get you sorted." He explained that Roberto would need to get off at the next stop, cross the platform, and take a downtown train. "Don't worry," he said with a grin. "Happens to everyone at some point." Relieved, Roberto thanked him and got off at the next stop, determined to follow the instructions. Now on the platform, Roberto looked around but couldn't see anything that looked like downtown. Just numbers, letters, and colors, like some strange puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. A woman with a huge shopping bag noticed his puzzled expression. "You look lost, hon. Need some help?" she asked kindly. "Yes, please," Roberto said, trying to explain that he needed to go to Brooklyn but ended up on the wrong train. "I'm very lost," he admitted. "Oh, honey, don't you worry," she said, chuckling. She explained that he should wait for the D train, which would take him downtown. But as she kept talking, her directions became more complex. She went on about express trains, local stops, and rush hour schedules, and soon Roberto's head was spinning. Eventually, she waved him off, assuring him, "Just stick to the D line and you'll be fine." With a nervous smile, Roberto thanked her and waited. Soon the D train arrived and Roberto got on, cautiously optimistic this time. As he rode, he began to recognize some landmarks from his guidebook, and his confidence grew. He even started humming to himself, imagining telling his friend about his grand tour of New York. Then he heard another announcement. Next stop, Coney Island. Roberto's jaw dropped. He'd gone too far again. Brooklyn was supposed to be halfway there. In his confusion, he had passed his stop without realizing it. He sighed, trying not to laugh at himself. "Maybe I'll see all of New York before I find Brooklyn." An older man sitting nearby chuckled, hearing Roberto's sigh. First time on the subway? Roberto nodded, feeling a bit sheepish. I thought it would be easy, he admitted. The man grinned. Well, let's get you back on track. You'll be a subway pro by the end of this. With the man's help, Roberto finally understood the basics. Trains could go uptown or downtown, and not all trains went everywhere he wanted to go. After several stops, transfers, and a lot of patience, Roberto finally arrived in Brooklyn. That was about the metro mishap, my friends, and I got a couple of vocabulary words that I want to share with you from this story. Let's start with the subway, of course. Well, the subway is an underground train system commonly used in big cities, like New York City, of course. We said Roberto took the subway to explore New York City. Then we have the word platform. Well, platform is the area where you stand to wait for a train. We said he waited on the platform, unsure of which train to take. And then we have downtown and uptown. Let's start with downtown. Well, this is a term used in big cities to describe the main, often southern part of a city. We said the young man told him to take the downtown train to reach his destination. An uptown refers to areas in the northern part of the city. Roberto accidentally took the uptown train instead of the downtown one. And finally, we have transfer. Well, transfer means changing from one train to another to reach your destination. For example, the man explained that Roberto needed to transfer trains to get to Brooklyn. So, what do we learn from his story? What are the key takeaways from the story? Well, the first and most important thing is that subways can be tricky, especially in cities like New York, with different directions and transfer points. So, when you're lost, don't hesitate to ask locals for help. Many people are happy to assist, even if they have their own unique way of explaining. And knowing simple terms like uptown, downtown, and platform can make navigating big cities much easier. So by the end of his subway adventure, Roberto learned more than he ever thought he would about New York's underground. He may have gone a bit out of his way, but he arrived in Brooklyn with new knowledge, a few new friends, and plenty of funny stories to tell. But that's not the end of our episode for today. We still have 2 more stories to talk about Roberto. And next, we're going to talk about Lost in Translation. You don't want to miss that. Stick around. I'll be right back. Roberto was nervous but excited. After all, he had an interview lined up for his first job in America. It wasn't a big job, just part-time work at a local cafe. But to him, it was a chance to start his new life, improve his English, and maybe make some American friends. He had prepared as best he could, practicing common interview questions like, "Why do you want this job?" and "What are your strengths and weaknesses?" His friend Lucy had even coached him on a few idioms he might hear. Though Roberto wasn't entirely sure what they meant, he just hoped he'd recognize them if they came up. As he entered the cafe, Roberto took a deep breath. Behind the counter, a friendly-looking woman introduced herself as Sarah and welcomed him to the interview room. She smiled, offering him a chair and his first question. "So, Roberto, tell me about yourself." Roberto nodded eagerly. "Yes, I am from Italy, and I love coffee. I think I am very good with coffee. My grandmother used to say, 'Roberto, you make coffee like a poet.'" He beamed, pleased with his answer. Sarah chuckled. "A poet, huh? I like that." The conversation seemed off to a good start, and Roberto relaxed. That is, until the next question. "So, Roberto, would you say you're someone who can work under pressure?" Roberto blinked, trying to remember if under pressure was one of the idioms he'd studied. He thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I work very well. Under tables, under chairs, under anything you need," he said a bit too confidently. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but she bit back a laugh. "That's creative. Well, let's move on." "Great. So, Roberto, tell me about a time when you went the extra mile for someone." Extra mile? Roberto was confused. Was he supposed to talk about walking? He thought hard, trying to come up with something impressive. Yes, once my friend Marco, he was moving, and I walked very far to help him carry his things. We went many miles with boxes." He smiled, proud of his story. Sarah gave him a sympathetic nod. "Okay, well, you're clearly dedicated." Feeling hopeful, Roberto waited for the next question. So, if a customer was unhappy with their coffee, how would you handle it? Roberto thought about this carefully. He wanted to give a good answer. I would say, I am sorry. Then I would give him a big hug, he replied earnestly. This time, Sarah couldn't hold back her laughter. A hug? That's a unique approach. Roberto shifted in his chair, slightly embarrassed. Yes, in Italy we hug a lot. Very friendly. Despite his mistake, Sarah seemed to be enjoying the interview. Her next question was about teamwork, and Roberto was determined to answer it correctly. So, Roberto, would you say you're a team player? He remembered Lucy's advice. Yes, I am a team playman. He grinned, confident he had nailed it. Sarah chuckled again, her amusement obvious. A playman, huh? Well, that's good to know. Now, by the end of the interview, Roberto was exhausted. He'd done his best, though he wasn't sure if it was enough. But as he stood to leave, Sarah smiled warmly and extended her hand. You know, Roberto, I think you'd be a great fit here. You've got a lot of heart, and that's what we need. Roberto's eyes lit up. Really? Even though I don't know the words? Sarah laughed and nodded. English can be learned. Kindness and enthusiasm? You already have those. So that was the story about this job interview, and of course, as usual, we have a couple of words that we need to talk about. We need to talk about interview, idioms, work under pressure, extra mile, and team player. Let's start with interview. Well, it's very basic, I know. It's a meeting where someone asks questions to decide if you're right for the job, especially, of course, when we're talking about job interview. Because interview can be a general word that can talk about anything. In our example, we said Roberto went to his first job interview in America. Next, we have idioms. These are common expressions that mean something different than the individual words. Now, for example, Roberto studied idioms like extra mile, but didn't fully understand them. And then we have work under pressure. Well, that means being able to stay calm and focused in stressful situations. Now, the interviewer asked if Roberto could work under pressure. And then we have the extra mile. Well, that means going beyond what expected to help or achieve something. Now, Roberto misunderstood going the extra mile and thought it meant walking far. He thought about it literally, but he didn't think about it as an idiom. And finally, we have team player, someone who works well with others. Now, despite calling himself a playman, Roberto showed he was a team player. Well, these were the words that I wanted to talk about in the context of this story, and now it's time to talk about some of the key takeaways we can learn from the story. The first thing is that idioms can be tricky because they often don't mean what they sound like. And words like pressure and team player have specific meanings in English, which can lead to funny misunderstandings. And finally, confidence and kindness can sometimes make up for language mistakes and help leave a positive impression. So even though Roberto struggled with the language, his sincerity and enthusiasm shone through. He realized that while English might have its confusing parts, being himself was the most important thing of all. And now, let's talk about our very last story for today. We're going to talk about Roberto the Romeo. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. After a few weeks in New York, Roberto's confidence was growing. He had started his part-time job at the cafe, was making friends, and was beginning to find his way around the city. But today was different. He had met someone. Her name was Emma, a regular customer at the cafe, and every time she came in, Roberto felt his heart skip a beat. She had a warm smile, big brown eyes, and a kindness that made him want to know her better. Determined to impress, Roberto decided he would ask her out. He had watched plenty of old Hollywood movies back in Italy, so he figured he'd picked up the right romantic expressions. As he approached her, he mentally rehearsed his lines, feeling like the lead in his own romantic comedy. Emma was sitting at a table reading a book when Roberto nervously approached, clearing his throat. "Hello, Emma," he began, trying to sound suave. You look, how do you say? You look like a flower in the morning dew." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "A flower in the morning dew?" Yes, Roberto said, smiling broadly. "Like you are fresh and like a rose that has just been watered. Beautiful." He leaned in slightly, proud of his poetic comparison. Emma giggled, clearly amused. "Well, thank you, Roberto. That's very sweet." Feeling encouraged, Roberto decided to keep going. I must say, he continued, when I see you, my heart, how do you say, jumps like a rabbit. Emma raised her eyebrows, trying not to laugh. Your heart jumps like a rabbit? Yes, he exclaimed, nodding eagerly. Like it cannot sit still, it is hopping all over. He made a hopping motion with his hand as if to demonstrate. Emma smiled, clearly entertained. Wow, Roberto, I've never been compared to a flower and a rabbit before. You're quite the romantic. Emboldened by her reaction, Roberto decided to bring out one of his favorite lines from the movies. He took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and said, Emma, I think I could die 1,000 deaths just to see you smile. Emma's smile turned into a look of surprise. 1,000 deaths? That's intense. Roberto nodded solemnly. Yes, I would go through fire or walk through the valley of the shadow of something dark just for you. Emma chuckled, clearly trying to keep her composure. That's very noble of you, Roberto, but you don't need to go through all that. Maybe just ask me for coffee. Roberto blinked, surprised with her directness. Oh, yes, coffee. That is what I meant, he said, laughing nervously. Would you like to have a coffee with me? Like, not at the cafe, somewhere romantic? Emma smiled warmly, nodding. I'd love that, Roberto, but maybe let's skip the dying 1,000 deaths part. He laughed, his cheeks turning red. Yes, no dying. Only coffee and maybe a walk under the stars? Now that sounds perfect, Emma said, her smile as wide as ever. Feeling victorious, Roberto stood up to leave, grinning from ear to ear. He was almost out the door when he turned back, remembering one last line he'd saved for special moments. Oh, and Emma, he called, making a dramatic pause. I will be waiting for you like a cactus in the desert waits for the rain. Emma burst out laughing, her laughter echoing through the cafe. I'll keep that in mind, Roberto. See you tonight. As he walked out, Roberto chuckled to himself, realizing that maybe his romantic lines needed a bit of an update. But at least he'd made her laugh, and that was a good start. So that was Roberto the Romeo, and now let's talk about some vocabulary words we can learn from this story. We have flirt, suave, amused, noble, and intense. Let's start with flirt. Well, to flirt is to behave playfully in a way that shows romantic interest. We said Roberto tried to flirt with Emma using old-fashioned expressions. And then we have suave, which means smooth, charming, and confident, often in a romantic or polite way. Now, Roberto wanted to be suave like a movie star. And then we have amused, which means entertained or finding something funny. Now, Emma was amused by Roberto's unique way of expressing himself. And then we have noble, which means showing high moral qualities, often in a way that's honorable or brave. Now, in our story, Roberto thought his dramatic lines made him sound noble. And finally, we have intense, which is very strong or serious and sometimes overwhelming. Now, Emma thought the idea of 1,000 deaths was a bit intense for coffee. So, what are the key takeaways from the story? First thing, romantic expressions can be tricky to get right in a new language, especially if they come from old movies. And then, sometimes humor and authenticity are more charming than trying too hard with dramatic lines. And finally, words like flirt and suave can describe romantic behavior, but it's important to keep it light-hearted. So, Roberto learned that being himself, even with a few language mishaps, could be just as charming as trying to be a Romeo. Emma's laughter showed him that sometimes sincerity and humor can be the best way to win someone's heart. And with that, my friends, we're done with today's episode. I hope you liked those stories. Next week, we're going to continue with 5 more stories from Roberto's story in the US, Roberto in America, and we're going to learn more vocabulary, more things to learn about American culture. You don't want to miss that, so stay tuned. But for the rest of the week, of course, we have other series to talk about, so stay tuned for those too. That'll be the end of our episode today. Thank you very much for listening. Remember, if you want to unlock the contents of all this episode, of all our back catalog in English Plus Podcasts, you can do that by becoming a premium subscriber on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. And don't forget to check out our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com, for a treasure trove of knowledge and English. Whatever your target is, if you want to improve your English, if you want to improve your knowledge, if you want to have some fun, If you are just curious to learn, to keep this lifelong learning torch alive, you can do that all by listening to English Plus Podcast, by watching our videos on English Plus Podcast on YouTube, or by going to our website, englishpluspodcast.com. With that being said, this is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening. I will see you next time. And remember, never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.